Imagine a man born on a dirt floor, in a cabin held together by mud and hope, who rose from the silent shadows of the Kentucky woods to carry the weight of a breaking nation. He was a rail splitter, a prairie lawyer, and a soul haunted by a deep, poetic melancholy. Yet his voice became the very heartbeat of freedom. Tonight, we leave the noise of the modern world behind to walk the long, dusty road with Abraham Lincoln, from the flickering light of a frontier hearth to the eternal glow of a martyr's legacy. Close your eyes, breathe with the rhythm of the old world, and listen to the story of a house divided and a spirit that could never be broken. In the deep, ancient silence of the Kentucky wilderness, where the shadows of the towering oaks stretch long across the forest floor, a small boy lay awake listening to the rhythmic sigh of the wind through the chinking of a one-room log cabin. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke and the sharp, clean scent of pine needles. This was the world of young Abraham Lincoln, a world carved out of the raw, unyielding timber of the frontier, where every morning began with the pale gray light, filtering through a single small window and the crackle of a dying hearth. His father, Thomas, was a man of iron and grit, a man whose hands were calloused by the heavy bite of the axe and the relentless pull of the plow against the stubborn roots of the sinking spring farm. The cabin was small, barely 16 feet by 18, with a dirt floor that felt cool beneath bare feet and walls made of unhewn logs that still whispered of the forest they once belonged to. Life was a slow, steady pulse of survival, a quiet war against the hunger of the winter and the isolation of the woods. Yet in this humble space, surrounded by the vast and lonely stretches of the American wild, there was a profound sense of beginning, a seed planted in the dark, rich soil of a new nation. The woods were a cathedral of green and gold where the only music was the call of the whippoorwill and the soft, steady rustle of the creek over smooth stones. Abraham grew tall and lean, his limbs reaching out like the saplings he learned to climb, his mind always wandering beyond the edge of the clearing, seeking something he could not yet name. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was a woman of gentle spirit and soft words, a flickering candle of warmth in the rugged chill of their frontier life. She would sit by the fire in the evenings, the golden light dancing across her face, and tell stories of a world far beyond the hills, her voice a soothing murmur that promised there was more to life than the toil of the fields. She taught him to look at the stars not just as distant lights, but as maps to the unknown. And though books were rare as diamonds in the wilderness, she nurtured a hunger in him that no amount of physical labor could ever satisfy. They lived by the seasons, the planting of the corn in the spring, the long, humid heat of the Kentucky summers, and the brisk, golden decay of autumn when the leaves fell like memories around the cabin door. But the frontier was as cruel as it was beautiful, and the silence of the woods often carried the weight of deep, unspoken sorrows. A shadow fell over the sunlit clearing when the milk sickness swept through the valley like a cold, invisible mist. Young Abraham watched as the strength faded from his mother's hands, the woman who had been his North Star becoming as frail as a winter leaf. The house grew quiet, the only sound being the heavy, labored breathing of a family facing the unthinkable. When she passed, the world seemed to hold its breath, the trees standing still in mourning. Thomas Lincoln fashioned a coffin from the very wood he had spent his life harvesting, and they buried her on a high, wooded knoll where the wind sang. Through the branches, Abraham stood by the fresh mound of earth, feeling a loneliness so vast it rivaled the expanse of the wilderness itself. The loss was a jagged tear in the fabric of his childhood, a silence that never truly left him. But even in that hollow ache, the lessons she gave him remained. The spark of curiosity she had lit continued to burn, a small, stubborn flame against the encroaching dark. Winter settled into the bones of the Kentucky hills with a fierce and biting cold that turned the creeks to glass. The cabin felt emptier now, the hearth colder without the grace of Nancy's presence. Thomas struggled to keep the flame of family alive, his face etched with the lines of a man who had buried his heart in the soil but had to keep walking for the sake of his children. They moved eventually, crossing the frozen waters into the even denser forests of Indiana, a journey of miles and miles through tangled brush and unbroken snow. Abraham walked beside the wagon, his feet numbing, his heart hardening. Into the resilient wood of the hickory trees he passed. He learned that the earth gives nothing for free, that every inch of progress is paid for in sweat and persistence. He became a master of the axe, the steady thud-thud-thud of steel against bark echoing through the lonely timber, a rhythmic heartbeat of a boy growing into a man of quiet, brooding strength. He carried his books in his pocket like talismans, reading by the flickering orange glow of the fire until his eyes grew heavy and the words blurred into dreams of a future where he might bridge the gap between the dirt floor of his birth and the high halls of justice. The stars above the frontier were bright and indifferent, watching the slow transformation of a boy who knew the weight of a log before he knew the weight of a crown. He was a creature of the edges, living between the wild and the civilized, between the physical ache of poverty and the intellectual soaring of his soul. He would lie on the cool grass after a day of clearing brush, looking up at the vast, indigo sky, wondering if his life would always be measured in cords of wood and bushels of corn, or if the whispers of his mother and the pull of the distant horizon meant he was destined for a different kind of labor. The cabin was his cradle, the woods were his school, and the hardship was his forge, stripping away everything unnecessary until only the core of the man remained, honest, enduring, and deeply rooted in the soil of the land he would one day fight to save. As the fire in the hearth turned to glowing embers and the cabin settled into the deep, restorative sleep of the midnight hour, the spirit of the boy remained awake, a quiet watcher in the dark, preparing for the long, winding road that led from the shadows of the Kentucky woods toward the blinding light of history. The embers of the evening fire glowed like fallen stars against the soot-stained hearth, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the rough-hewn walls of the Indiana cabin, where young Abraham lay stretched out upon the cool dirt floor, his chin resting in his palms, and his eyes fixed upon the worn pages of a borrowed book. The world outside was a vast, impenetrable curtain of blackness, the wolves howling at the moon and the wind whispering through the skeletal branches of the winter oaks. But for the boy, the wilderness had vanished, replaced by the rhythmic cadence of sentences and the electric hum of new ideas. He had no desk but the floor, no lamp but the dying orange pulse of the fire. Yet he followed each line of text with a hunger that physical food could never satisfy. His fingers, stained with the dust of the fields and the sap of the pines, turned the pages as if they were fragile glass. He knew that in this isolated clearing, knowledge was the only bridge to a life beyond the horizon, a way to transcend the grinding cycle of the plow and the axe. And so he read until the fire faded to gray ash, memorizing passages of Aesop's fables and the life of George Washington, the words sinking deep into his soul like seeds planted in the rich, dark loam of the prairie, waiting for their season to bloom. The silence of the frontier was not a void, but a classroom where the rustle of a page sounded like a thunderclap of possibility. Abraham became a seeker of stories, walking miles through the tangled brush and the knee-deep snow just to borrow a single volume from a distant neighbor. He would carry these treasures home tucked inside his shirt, close to his heart, guarding them against the dampness of the woods as if they were sacred relics. When he worked in the fields, he would rest his book at the end of a furrow, reading a few precious lines every time he turned the horse, the rhythm of his labor becoming entwined with the rhythm of the prose. He would scrawl mathematical sums on the back of a wooden shovel using a piece of charred coal, rubbing the wood clean only when there was no space left for his numbers. His mind was a sharpening stone, constantly grinding against the hard realities of his surroundings, refining his thoughts into clear, piercing logic. He found a strange and beautiful companionship in the writings of long-dead thinkers, their voices reaching through the centuries to speak to a lonely boy in a log cabin, telling him that the mind is a kingdom that no poverty can ever truly conquer, and that a man's worth is measured not by the height of his barns, but by the depth of his understanding. A soft, golden haze seemed to settle over the cabin whenever the boy lost himself in the magic of the written word. His stepmother, Sarah Bush Johnston, watched him with a quiet, knowing smile, recognizing the restless fire in his eyes and providing him with the precious scraps of paper and the stubs of pencils that were more valuable to him than gold. She saw that while his hands were built for the heavy lifting of the frontier, his spirit was built for the heavy lifting of the law and the state. Together they created a sanctuary of quiet encouragement, a space where his intellect could stretch and grow. Even when his body was exhausted from a day of splitting rails, he would recite his favorite speeches to the trees, the vast forest becoming his silent audience, his voice echoing through the glades as he practiced the art of persuasion, learning how a single, well-placed word could hold more power than 1,000 swings of a hammer. He was self-taught, but never alone, for he walked with the giants of history, their wisdom flowing through him like the steady, subterranean currents of a hidden spring, nourishing his ambition and softening the edges of his rugged life with the grace of poetry and the iron of philosophy. The moon climbed high over the Indiana timber, casting a silver light that turned the snow into a sea of diamonds and the cabin into a lonely island of thought. Abraham grew into a man whose height was matched only by the reach of his curiosity. His long, thin frame often bent over a book while others slept the heavy sleep of the weary. He understood that his education was a slow, deliberate construction, a temple built brick by brick with every page he mastered and every concept he wrestled into submission. There were no teachers to guide him, no libraries to offer him choices, only his own unyielding will and the occasional gift of a tattered newspaper that brought news of the distant, bustling cities and the brewing storms of politics. He felt the pull of the world beyond the trees, a call to join the great conversation of humanity, and he prepared himself in the stillness, honing his speech to be as clear as a mountain stream and his character to be as sturdy as the white oaks he felled. The cabin was no longer a prison of poverty, but a laboratory of the soul, where a common laborer was forging himself into a scholar, a leader, and a voice for the voiceless. As the first light of dawn began to bleed through the cracks in the cabin walls, the boy finally closed his book, the weight of the knowledge he had gathered feeling like a solid, comforting presence in the morning chill. He rose to meet the day's toil, his muscles aching but his mind soaring, the words he had read overnight continuing to echo in his thoughts like a soft, persistent melody. He stepped out into the crisp air, the scent of the waking forest filling his lungs, and he looked toward the rising sun with a clarity that had been won in the long hours of the night. He knew that the road ahead would be long and filled with shadows, but he was no longer afraid of the dark, for he carried the light of learning within him, a flame that would eventually burn bright enough to illuminate a whole nation. And as he took up his axe for the first task of the morning, He did so with the quiet dignity of a man who knew that his story was only just beginning. A story written not just in the dust of the frontier, but in the enduring ink of the human spirit, resting now in the peaceful, rhythmic breath of the sleeping wilderness. The golden light of his self-taught wisdom followed him like a quiet companion as he stepped out from the deep shadows of the Indiana timber and found himself standing on the high, grassy bluffs of the Sangamon River, where the small, bustling village of New Salem sat perched like a dream of progress against the vast, rolling Illinois prairie. It was here that the tall, gangly youth with the weary eyes and the gentle smile began to weave himself into the fabric of a community, arriving with nothing but the clothes on his back and a mind sharpened by the winter fires. He took up work in a small wooden store where the scent of dry goods, salted pork, and calico fabric hung heavy in the air, standing behind the counter with his long limbs seemingly too large for the room. Yet his presence brought a strange and steady calm to the local farmers and their families. He spoke with a slow, rhythmic drawl that invited trust. And it was in this humble shop that the legend of his integrity began to take root in the soil of the town. For if a customer accidentally overpaid by a few pennies, or if the scales were tilted ever so slightly in his favor, he would lock the door at the end of the day and walk miles through the twilight and the evening due just to return the change, his shadow lengthening across the dusty roads as he moved with a singular purpose to ensure that his conscience remained as clear as the river water. And soon, the whispers began to spread from porch to porch and hearth to hearth that this man, this Abraham, was a man of his word, a man who could be trusted with the truth, and the name, Honest Abe, began to settle upon him not as a burden, but as a natural extension of his soul. The river continued its endless, murmuring journey beneath the bluffs, reflecting the changing colors of the Illinois sky, just as Abraham's life began to reflect the diverse needs of the people he served. He became the village postmaster, carrying the town's mail inside his high beaver hat so that he could deliver letters personally to those working in the fields, his tall silhouette appearing on the horizon like a harbinger of connection, reading the news aloud to those who could not read and sharing in their joys and their quiet heartbreaks as they received word from distant kin. He sat by the flickering light of the communal lamps and listened to the grievances of the settlers, his heart becoming a vessel for their stories and his mind a bridge between their struggles and the promise of the law. He felt the pulse of the nation in the small talk of the general store and the weary sighs of the pioneers, and he realized that to lead was not to stand above, but to walk beside, to understand the weight of a neighbor's plow and the depth of a mother's worry. He took up the surveyor's chain and compass next, tramping through the tall prairie grass and the muddy bottomlands to mark the boundaries of a growing world. His eyes fixed on the distant markers, but his feet firmly planted in the mud, learning that a straight line was more than just a measurement. It was a commitment to order and a promise of a shared future. A soft, amber glow seemed to settle over the village as the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the Sangamon into a ribbon of liquid fire and bringing a temporary peace to the restless heart of the young leader. In the quiet hours when the chores were done and the village fell into a hushed stillness, he would sit on a fallen log near the water's edge, the cricket song rising in a gentle crescendo around him, and he would reflect on the faces he had seen that day, the calloused hands he had shaken, and the quiet dignity of the men and women who were building a civilization out of the raw earth. He felt a new kind of hunger stirring within him, a desire to represent these voices in the grand halls he had only read about in his borrowed books. He began to study the law with a renewed intensity, the logic of the statutes blending with the common sense of the frontier, his thoughts flowing like the river toward a sea of greater responsibility. He was no longer just the boy from the log cabin or the clerk behind the counter. He was becoming the conscience of New Salem, a man whose roots were deepening even as his branches reached for the clouds, his character being forged in the small, everyday acts of kindness and the unwavering commitment to the truth that defined his every hour. The stars emerged one by one, cold and brilliant over the dark silhouette of the mills and the quiet cabins where the people of the prairie lay sleeping. Abraham walked back to his small quarters, his boots crunching softly on the dry grass, the night air cool against his face and the smell of the coming rain faint on the breeze. He knew that his time in this village was a season of preparation, a brief and beautiful chapter where he learned the language of the human heart and the strength found in communal trust. He thought of the Honest Abe title and how it felt like a silent vow he had made to the land and its people, a vow he would carry with him through the storms that were surely gathering in the distance. He looked back at the dim lanterns of New Salem and felt a profound gratitude for the simple honesty of the frontier life, for the lessons learned in the pursuit of a few pennies and the mapping of a few acres. As he closed his eyes and let the rhythmic breathing of the sleeping town lull him into his own rest, he felt the weight of his destiny beginning to settle upon his shoulders, not as a heavy stone, but as a steadying hand, guiding him away from the familiar riverbanks and toward the great, unfolding drama of a nation in search of its soul. The steady, rhythmic pulse of the Sangamon River eventually faded into the background of his memory, replaced by the rhythmic thud of horse hooves on the dusty trails of the 8th Judicial Circuit, where the wide, open sea of the Illinois prairie stretched out in every direction under a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the very earth. Abraham was now a man of the law, a traveling advocate carrying his papers in his hat and his books in a weathered saddleback, riding from one county seat to another through the driving rain of spring and the sweltering, golden heat of midsummer. He moved across the landscape like a tall, solitary shadow, his long legs dangling nearly to the ground as he sat atop his horse, Old Buck, his mind always churning, always dissecting the complexities of human nature that he encountered in the crowded, humid courtrooms of the frontier. These were not the polished halls of justice found in the East, but simple log structures and brick courthouses where the air was thick with the scent of tobacco and damp wool, and where the farmers and tradesmen gathered to watch him speak. He had a way of standing before a jury that made the room grow still, his voice starting out high and thin, but deepening into a resonant, melodic baritone as he spun his arguments with the precision of a master weaver, using simple stories and folksy humor to dismantle the most complex legal traps. He fought for the widow whose land was being stolen and the laborer who had been cheated of his wages, treating every case as a sacred trust, his sharp, piercing logic cutting through deception like a hot knife through wax, yet always tempered by a profound, melancholy empathy for the fallible men and women who stood before the bench. The dust of the road would settle on his black coat like the weight of the secrets he carried for his clients, but his spirit remained as unyielding as the tall grass that bowed but never broke in the prairie wind. Evening after evening, he would arrive at a flickering tavern or a crowded boarding house, sharing a bed with fellow lawyers and judges, the room filled with the low murmur of legal debate and the crackle of a dying fire. While others slept, Abraham would often sit by a single candle, his shadow looming large against the timbered walls as he studied his briefs or lost himself in the geometric beauty of Euclid's theorems to sharpen his mind. He found that the law was not just a set of rules but a reflection of the human soul's struggle for order and fairness in a wild world. He became famous for his almanac trial, where he used the celestial timing of the moon to prove a witness was lying about what he saw in the dark. A moment of brilliant clarity that saved a man's life and solidified his reputation as a defender of the truth. He didn't just win cases, he won hearts. Because the people saw that his quest for justice was not driven by greed or ambition, but by a deep-seated need to see the scales balanced. His laughter would echo through the tavern halls, a sudden, booming sound that could break the tension of a long day. Yet in the quiet moments when the laughter died away, his eyes would return to that distant, contemplative gaze, looking toward a horizon that was beginning to darken with the clouds of a much larger conflict. A sense of heavy, expectant silence often followed him into the courtroom as the sun began its slow descent, casting long, amber fingers across the wooden benches and the expectant faces of the jury. He knew that the small disputes over property lines and horse trades were merely the tremors before a great earthquake, for the question of liberty was beginning to seep into every legal argument and every political discussion in the taverns of Illinois. He spoke for the common man with a clarity that made the complex seem simple and the ignored seem vital. His speeches were not performances, but conversations. Rooted in the same honesty he had practiced in the stores of New Salem, he would lean in close to the jury box, his face etched with the lines of experience and his hands gesturing with a slow, deliberate grace, making each listener feel as though they were the only person in the world who could help him find the right path. He was a bridge builder, connecting the raw, unpolished life of the frontier to the high ideals of the Constitution, believing that the law was the only thing that could hold a fracturing society together. As he rode his circuit month after month, the prairie became his cathedral and the law became his faith, a steadying force that gave him the strength to face the mounting pressures of a nation that was slowly, painfully dividing itself. The night air over the Illinois plains grew cool and crisp, carrying the scent of harvested corn and the distant, lonely call of a locomotive's whistle. Abraham would often step outside the tavern for one last look at the stars before turning in, the immense silence of the prairie reminding him of his humble beginnings in that Kentucky woods. He was no longer just a rail splitter or a clerk. He was a man who understood the power of the word and the necessity of the right. His journey through the circuit courts had prepared him for a stage he could not yet fully imagine, teaching him the patience of the hunter and the wisdom of the sage. He knew the heart of the American people because he had sat in their kitchens and argued in their town squares, and he felt a growing, quiet resolve to take these lessons of justice to a higher level. The courtroom had been his training ground, a place where he learned that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, would always eventually find its way into the light. He felt the pull of the future like a tide, a relentless movement toward a destiny that would require everything he had learned about mercy, logic, and the stubborn pursuit of what is fair. As the candle finally sputtered and went out, leaving the room in a soft, velvet darkness, the prairie lawyer allowed himself to sink into the restorative embrace of sleep. The images of the day's trial faded into the gentle rustle of the wind against the shutters, the faces of the judges and the farmers blurring into the peaceful landscape of his dreams. He rested with the quiet confidence of a man who had done his duty, knowing that tomorrow would bring another road, another courthouse, and another chance to stand up for those who could not stand for themselves. The circuit was his home. The people were his family, and the pursuit of justice was the light that guided him through the long, lonely stretches of the night. And as the moon moved silently across the sky, watching over the sleeping towns of the frontier, the man who would one day lead a nation slept deeply, his heart beating in time with the steady, enduring pulse of the land he loved so well, resting now in the stillness, ready for the dawn. The echoes of the courthouse gavels and the quiet dust of the prairie trail seemed to linger in the air like a fading memory as Abraham stepped onto a much larger and more dangerous stage. The soft evening breeze of Illinois now carrying the scent of a gathering storm. A storm that was not made of rain but of the heavy, conflicting passions of a nation at war with its own conscience. He stood tall and resolute, his frame etched against the twilight sky of Springfield, delivering words that would vibrate through the timber of every house in the land, declaring that a house divided against itself cannot stand. His voice was no longer just the voice of a local lawyer, but the resonant tolling of a bell warning of a fire in the night. He spoke of the deep, moral fracture of slavery with a clarity that was both terrifying and beautiful. A conviction that had simmered in the quiet hours of his midnight studies and finally boiled over into the public square. The people gathered in the thousands, their faces illuminated by the flickering orange glow of torches, listening to this man who looked like the very earth he came from, rugged and unpolished yet filled with a terrifyingly precise logic that stripped away the comforts of compromise. He saw the Union not just as a map of states, but as a sacred idea, a promise of liberty that was being strangled by the chains of the South and the indifference of the North. And as he spoke, the shadows of the past and the ghosts of the future seemed to huddle close to hear the truth. The torchlight flickered against the stern, watchful faces of the crowds as the great debates with Stephen Douglas began to unfold across the dusty towns of the frontier. 7 times they met under the vast, open canopy of the American sky, the little giant and the tall rail splitter, their voices clashing like iron against stone in a rhythmic dance of intellect and soul. Abraham would stand with his thumbs tucked into his suspenders, his eyes burning with a somber light, his words flowing with the slow, deliberate pace of a deep river. He challenged the very foundation of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, arguing that freedom was not a matter of local choice but a universal right granted by the Creator. The air was thick with the heat of the afternoon sun and the tension of a people searching for a path through the darkness. Douglas spoke with the thunder of a practiced orator, but Lincoln spoke with the haunting simplicity of a prophet, his arguments building brick by brick until they formed an unbreakable wall of moral necessity. He didn't just talk of laws and territories. He talked of the fundamental right of a man to eat the bread his own hands had earned, his voice reaching out to the farmers, the blacksmiths, and the shopkeepers, making them feel the weight of the chains as if they were their own. The debates were a slow, cinematic unfolding of a national crisis, a conversation that started on a wooden platform and ended in the very heart of the American identity. A quiet, reflective stillness often followed these grand confrontations as the sun dipped low and the spectators drifted back to their homes in the cool blue of the evening. Abraham would sit in the back of a jolting wagon or a soot-stained train car, the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of the wheels on the iron rails providing a somber backdrop to his thoughts. He knew that while he might lose the immediate battle for the Senate, he was winning something far more enduring, the trust of a people who were tired of shadows and hungry for the light. His name began to travel eastward, carried on the wings of newspapers and the excited whispers of travelers, reaching the marble halls of New York and the brick streets of Boston. He was the man from the West, the giant who had risen from the woods to challenge the status quo, his house-divided speech becoming a lighthouse for those lost in the fog of political maneuvering. He felt the immense gravity of the moment, the way the history of a century was narrowing down to a single point of decision, and he prepared himself in the silence, honing his message until it was as sharp as the axe he had wielded as a boy, knowing that the words he uttered today would become the foundations upon which a new, unified nation would either stand or fall. The stars above the Illinois plains seemed to pulse with a nervous energy as the news of his rising fame spread like a slow-burning fire across the autumn leaves. He was invited to speak at the Cooper Union in the heart of the great city, where the sophisticated men of the East waited with skepticism for the arrival of the frontier lawyer. But when he stepped onto that stage, dressed in a suit that didn't quite fit his long, awkward limbs, and began to speak with that same slow, haunting sincerity, the room fell into a trance. He untangled the history of the Constitution with the grace of a scholar and the grit of a pioneer, proving that the founders had never intended for slavery to be an eternal part of the American fabric. By the time he finished, the audience was on its feet, the skepticism replaced by a profound, hushed awe, for they had found more than a politician. They had found a leader whose soul was as deep as the forest he had cleared. His rise to national fame was not a sudden burst of light, but a slow, steady dawn, the inevitable result of a lifetime spent in the pursuit of truth and the quiet labor of the mind. He returned to his home in Springfield, the shadows of the White House already beginning to stretch toward him. A man who had started in a log cabin and was now poised to lead a nation through its darkest night. As the lamps were extinguished in the Lincoln home and the streets of the town grew quiet under the watchful moon, Abraham sat by the window, looking out at the world he was about to change forever. The weight of his destiny was no longer a distant whisper, but a heavy, tangible presence in the room. He thought of the Kentucky woods, the Indiana snows, and the river bluffs of New Salem, and he realized that every step of his journey had been a preparation for the trial that lay ahead. He was the bridge between the old world and the new, the man who would have to hold the house together even as it threatened to crumble around him. He felt a deep, melancholy peace, the kind that comes only when a man accepts a burden he knows he was born to carry. His heart beat in a slow, steady rhythm, matching the pulse of the sleeping land. And as he finally closed his eyes, the words of his speeches continued to echo in the silence, a promise of a union that would one day be whole, a promise that began in the heart of a prairie lawyer and would soon echo through the halls of history, resting now in the gentle, restorative breath of the American night. The distant, flickering lights of New York and the echoing applause of Cooper Union seemed to drift away like smoke, replaced by the heavy, humid stillness of a Springfield summer where the air itself felt thick with the weight of an impending transformation. Abraham sat on his porch as the telegraph wires hummed with the electric tension of a country nearing its breaking point. The 1860 Republican Convention in Chicago had been a whirlwind of shouting men and sawdust-covered floors. Yet here, in the quiet heart of Illinois, the man who had been the darkest of horses waited with a calm that bordered on the supernatural. When the news finally arrived that he had been chosen to lead the young party, he didn't celebrate with the roar of a victor, but with the quiet, somber reflection of a man who knew he was being called to a sacrifice. The election season that followed was a fractured mirror of the soul of the nation, with four men vying for the soul of the Republic and the South, breathing threats of fire and secession like a dragon waking from a long slumber. Abraham remained mostly silent in his home, a tall, silent figure in the eye of the storm, knowing that his words had already been spoken and his character was already written in the logs of his cabin and the pages of his law books. The people came to him in droves, filling the dusty streets of Springfield just to catch a glimpse of the rail splitter who would be king. And as the autumn leaves turned to a deep, blood red against the prairie sky, the realization began to sink into the marrow of the land that the old world was dying and a new, uncertain era was being born in the ballot box. The red leaves fell like silent warnings onto the cobblestones of the town square as the election day arrived with a clarity that felt like the sharp edge of a winter frost. Abraham walked alone to the polling place, his shadow long and thin against the morning light, feeling the immense gravity of 1,000,000 lives resting upon his narrow shoulders. When the results began to trickle in through the clicking telegraph keys, showing state after state in the north turning toward the tall man from the west, the atmosphere in the Springfield Telegraph office grew thick with a mixture of exhilaration and a deep, creeping dread. He had won the presidency without a single Southern state, a victory that felt like a clean break in the bone of the Union. The celebrations in the streets were loud and bright with bonfires, but inside the Lincoln home, the candles burned low and the air was filled with a heavy, contemplative silence. He looked at his wife, Mary, and his sons, and he saw in their faces the reflection of a country that was no longer one, but two. The news from Charleston and Richmond came like distant thunder. Talk of conventions and departures, of flags being lowered and new ones being raised. And Abraham understood that he was not merely moving into a house of white stone, but into a fortress that was already under siege, his heart beating with a slow, steady resolve to hold the fragments of the Republic together even if the world around him chose to tear itself apart. A cold, gray mist clung to the tracks of the Great Western Railroad as the train stood puffing steam into the winter air, waiting to carry the president-elect away from the only home he had ever truly known. He stood on the rear platform of the car, looking out at the faces of his neighbors through a veil of soft, falling rain, his voice trembling slightly as he told them that he was leaving with a task before him greater than that which rested upon Washington. It was a farewell that sounded like a prayer, a slow and mournful melody that echoed off the brick buildings and the leafless trees. The journey to the Capitol was a long, winding path through a landscape of growing hostility, with rumors of assassination plots whispering in the shadows of Baltimore, and the air turning colder with every mile traveled eastward. He had to enter Washington in the dead of night, a ghost in a soft hat and a long coat, slipping into the city like a stranger in his own house. The Capitol was a place of unfinished monuments and half-built domes, a perfect mirror for a nation that was still a work in progress. He walked through the halls of the White House for the first time, the floors creaking under his weight, the portraits of the men before him watching with silent, judging eyes as he prepared to take an oath that many believed would be his last. The marble of the Capitol building shone with a pale, ghostly light under the overcast sky of March as the inauguration began, with the glint of bayonets and the watchful eyes of sharpshooters on the rooftops. Abraham stood before the crowd, his tall hat resting on the table, and he spoke to the South not as enemies, but as brothers who had lost their way. His voice carried by the wind over the sea of anxious faces. He told them that we are not enemies but friends, that though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The words were a gentle plea, a cinematic moment of grace before the falling of the curtain. Yet even as he spoke the oath of office, the news of Fort Sumter was already ripening in the dark, a bitter fruit that would soon burst and drown the land in sorrow. He moved into the executive mansion, a man who had traveled from a dirt floor to the highest seat in the land, only to find that the seat was a throne of thorns. The hallways were filled with office seekers and soldiers, but in the private hours of the night, he would walk the corridors alone, the weight of the coming war pressing down on him until he felt he might break. He was the pilot of a ship heading into a hurricane, his eyes fixed on the distant, invisible shore of peace. As the first lamps were lit in the White House and the city of Washington settled into a restless, uneasy sleep, the new president sat at his heavy oak desk, the silence of the room amplified by the ticking of a lone clock. He thought of the woods of Kentucky and how simple the struggles of his youth seemed compared to the tectonic shifts of the present. He was no longer a lawyer or a politician. He was the keeper of a sacred flame, a man whose every decision would be measured in the lives of his countrymen. The tension of the 1860 election had passed, but the trial of the Union had only just begun. He leaned back in his chair, his face etched with a fatigue that no sleep could wash away. Yet there was a stubborn, quiet light in his eyes that spoke of a will made of iron and a heart made of mercy. The nation stood on the brink of an abyss, and he was the only one holding the rope, his breath slow and rhythmic in the quiet office, as he prepared himself for the long, bloody years that lay ahead. A man of the people, for the people, standing alone in the dark, waiting for the dawn of a conflict that would redefine the meaning of freedom forever, resting now in the heavy, expectant hush of history. The hopeful echoes of his inaugural plea for friendship lingered in the cold marble hallways like a ghost of a peace that was never meant to be. For as the spring of 1861 breathed life into the gardens of Washington, a different and darker energy was gathering over the harbor of Charleston, where the stone walls of Fort Sumter stood lonely against the gray Atlantic tide. Abraham sat in the quiet of his office, the heavy oak desk cluttered with reports that smelled of salt water and gunpowder, his eyes tracing the lines of a map that showed his country tearing apart like a piece of ancient parchment. When the first telegraph arrived, the clicking of the key sounding like a hammer on a coffin, announcing that the cannons had finally spoken and the flag had fallen, a profound and terrible silence descended upon his soul. He felt the weight of the crown not as a golden prize, but as a circle of iron that pressed against his temples. He was now a commander of a war he never wanted, a leader of a house that had finally collapsed into the flames. He walked to the window and looked out at the unfinished dome of the Capitol, realizing that every life lost from that moment on would be a burden he would carry to his grave. His heart, which had always been prone to a gentle melancholy, now sank into a deep, oceanic sorrow as he issued the call for 75,000 volunteers, knowing that he was asking sons to march against fathers and brothers to stain the soil of their own fields with blood. The smoke from the first fires of rebellion drifted northward, clouding the sun and turning the bright promise of his presidency into a long, shadowed corridor of impossible choices. He became a prisoner of the telegraph office, a tall, haunting figure wrapped in a gray shawl, pacing the floor as the news of defeat at Bull Run came through the wires. The realization that this would not be a short, glorious skirmish but a long, bloody ordeal began to etch deeper lines into his face, turning his skin to the color of weathered stone and his eyes into deep wells of unspoken grief. He watched the young men in their blue uniforms marching past the White House, their faces bright, with a naive courage that made his chest ache, for he saw them not as soldiers, but as the children of the frontier he had once been. He felt the political vultures circling in the dark, the radicals demanding fire and the conservatives demanding compromise. Yet he stood in the center of the storm like a gnarled oak, refusing to be moved. His nights were spent in a restless vigil, the floorboards creaking under his boots as he walked the hallways at 3 a.m, sometimes stopping to lean his forehead against the cold glass of a window, praying for a wisdom that felt just out of reach. The country was bleeding from 1,000 wounds, and he felt every one of them in his own flesh. The unity he loved so dearly becoming a fragmented dream that he had to piece back together with hands that were trembling from the sheer scale of the catastrophe. A heavy, suffocating blanket of grief settled over the executive mansion when the war reached inside its very walls to claim his own beloved son, Willie, leaving the president to navigate the wreckage of a nation while his own heart was drowning in a personal sea of shadows. He had to stand tall for the public, his voice steady as he spoke of the necessity of the Union. while in the private rooms, he wept for a boy who would never grow to see the peace his father was trying to build. The pressure was a physical force, a constant, low-grade fever of anxiety that made his food taste like ash and his sleep a fragmented mosaic of battle maps and casualty lists. He searched for a general who could match his own iron resolve, someone who understood that the war was not a game of maneuvers, but a grim, necessary surgery to save the patient. He visited the hospitals where the smell of antiseptic and suffering hung in the air, moving from cot to cot with a soft word and a gentle touch. His presence a quiet benediction to the broken boys who looked up at him, as if he were a father to them all. He was learning that to be a leader in a time of war is to be a professional mourner, a man who must keep his eyes on the horizon of victory while his feet are mired in the mud of the valley of death. The crown was heavy, yes, but it was the souls of the dead that truly weighed him down. The stars above the Potomac seemed to dim behind the thick, sulphurous haze of 1,000 campfires, reflecting a world where the familiar landmarks of law and order had been swallowed by the chaos of the conflict. Abraham began to realize that the war could not be won by silver tongues or legalistic arguments alone, that the very soul of the nation had to be transformed in the crucible of the fight. He wrestled with the ghosts of the founding fathers, wondering if the Constitution he had sworn to protect was a suicide pact or a living testament that could survive the amputation of its oldest sin. He felt the pull of a higher law, a slow-moving tide of moral necessity that was pushing him toward a decision that would either save the Republic or shatter it forever. He sat in the stillness of the telegraph office, the rhythmic tapping of the machines sounding like a heartbeat, and he began to draft the words that would change the meaning of the struggle, his pen moving with a slow, deliberate grace over the paper, each letter a vow to the men who had fallen in the wheat fields and the peach orchards. He was no longer just protecting a map. He was fighting for the very idea of humanity, and though the darkness was at its thickest, he felt a small, stubborn spark of hope beginning to flicker in the depths of his exhaustion. As the lamps burned low in the war-weary city and the distant rumble of wagons on the cobblestones signaled the arrival of more wounded, the commander-in-chief finally leaned back in his chair and allowed the silence to wrap around him. He thought of the quiet woods of Kentucky and the simple, honest peace of his youth, wondering if he would ever know that stillness again or if his soul was destined to be a permanent battlefield. The war had aged him a decade in a single year, his hair turning silver and his frame growing even thinner. Yet there was a new, crystalline clarity in his gaze, a resolve that had been forged in the white-hot heat of the national agony. He was the anchor of a ship in a hurricane, the single point of stability in a world that had lost its mind. And as he prepared to close his eyes for a few hours of fitful rest, he whispered a silent promise to the millions who were sleeping in the mud and the millions who were waiting in chains. He would not let the house fall. He would not let the dream die. And through the long, lonely watches of the night, he remained the faithful sentry of freedom, resting now in the heavy, prayerful hush of a nation waiting for its rebirth. The iron ring of the presidency had become a crown of thorns that pressed harder with every passing casualty list. Yet in the deep, midnight silence of his study, Abraham felt a different kind of pressure, a quiet, divine tapping at the window of his soul that told him the war could no longer be fought for a map alone. He sat at his desk with a heavy pen in hand, the shadows of the flickering candles stretching like long, dark fingers across the parchment where he was carving out a new destiny. For 4 million souls. He knew that to sign this paper was to change the very chemistry of the American air, to turn a war of territory into a holy crusade for the fundamental dignity of man. On the first day of January in 1863, His hand was stiff from shaking hundreds of greetings, so he paused, waiting for his grip to become steady because he wanted his signature to be firm and clear, showing no trace of hesitation to the eyes of history. With a slow, deliberate stroke, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, and in that moment, the chains that had bound the nation's conscience for centuries began to rust and snap. The words spread through the slave quarters and the battlefields like a soft, rising wind, carrying the scent of a freedom that had been a dream for generations but was now a legal, unyielding fact. He felt a strange, melancholy peace descend upon him, knowing that even if he were to fall tomorrow, the sun would rise on a country that could never truly go back to what it was before. For he had finally aligned the law of the land with the law of the heart, setting the ship of state on a course toward a horizon where every man could stand tall under the open sky. The echoes of the breaking chains vibrated through the blood-soaked soil of Pennsylvania, where the town of Gettysburg lay hushed and broken under a summer sun that had seen the greatest slaughter of the age. A few months later, Abraham sat on a jolting train car, his long legs cramped and his head bowed, scribbling a few brief remarks on a piece of scrap paper as the scenery of a wounded nation blurred past the window. He arrived at the battlefield not to boast of victory, but to mourn the harvest of death. Standing on a wooden platform overlooking thousands of fresh mounds of earth while the scent of turned soil and distant smoke still hung in the cool November air, his voice, high and clear, carried across the silent crowd like a prayer in a cathedral, speaking for only 2 minutes but uttering words that would be etched into the very stone of the Republic. He spoke of a new birth of freedom, reminding the weeping mothers and the hollow-eyed soldiers that the brave men who struggled there had already consecrated the ground far beyond his poor power to add or detract. He redefined democracy not as a dry political arrangement, but as a living, breathing promise of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. His words were like a soft rain falling on a parched field, promising that the sacrifice of the fallen would not be in vain, and that the Union would emerge from the fire not just mended, but purified. A hallowed stillness followed his descent from the platform, a silence so profound it felt as though the earth itself were absorbing the weight of his promise. He returned to the White House with the face of a man who had seen the end of the world and was trying to glimpse the beginning of a new one, his nights becoming even more wakeful as the moral clarity of his mission gave him a strength that his frail body should not have possessed. He began to see the faces of the liberated in his dreams, the old men who wept at the mention of his name, and the young boys in blue who carried his proclamation into the heart of the South like a shield of light. The political storms still raged around him, but they felt like distant thunder now, for he had anchored his soul to the bedrock of universal liberty. He spent hours in the quiet company of the soldiers, listening to their stories with a patient, fatherly grace, his presence a steadying force in a world that was still spinning out of control. He was no longer just the president. He was the Great Emancipator, a title that felt like a heavy, beautiful mantle made of the hopes of the oppressed and the prayers of the righteous. He understood that the path to peace was still long and paved with more sorrow, but he walked it with a steady, rhythmic step, his heart beating in time with the slow, inevitable march of justice. The stars over the Capitol seemed to burn with a new, crystalline light as the year turned toward its final chapters, reflecting a nation that was slowly, painfully finding its soul in the wreckage of its past. Abraham sat by the window of the telegraph office, watching the snow fall softly over the Potomac, the white flakes covering the scars of the earth and the cannons of the forts in a temporary, deceptive peace. He knew that the proclamation and the speech were only the beginning of a much larger labor, a labor of healing and reconstruction that would require more mercy than the world had ever seen. He felt a deep, ancestral connection to the land, a sense that the dirt floor of his Kentucky cabin and the marble floors of the White House were part of the same long, winding story of a man and a country growing up together. His eyes were tired, but they held a vision of a future where the word citizen would mean the same thing for everyone. A future where the house would no longer be divided, but would stand as a beacon to all who hungered for a place in the sun. He leaned his head back against the chair, the rhythmic ticking of the clock sounding like the steady pulse of a giant heart. And for a moment, the weight of the crown felt lighter, the burden of the war felt distant, and the spirit of the prairie lawyer rested in the quiet, restorative glow of a freedom that was finally, truly, beginning to bloom. The promise of a new birth of freedom began to settle over the landscape like a soft, golden mist, even as the distant rumble of the heavy siege guns at Petersburg told of a world still caught in the final, desperate throes of a long night. Abraham sat in the quiet of his office, his face now a map of deep canyons and shadows, his eyes weary with the weight of 600,000 souls. But in the rhythm of the telegraph's click he finally heard the steady, relentless march of General Grant. Moving toward the finish line, he saw in Grant a man of the same rugged earth as himself, a man who did not look for glory, but for the end of the suffering. And as the spring of 1865 began to wake the sleeping trees of Virginia, the news arrived that the iron gates of Richmond had finally buckled. The city of the rebellion was falling into smoke and ash. Yet when Abraham traveled to that broken capital, he did not walk with the stride of a conqueror or the fire of a vengeful god. He walked the streets as a man of peace, his tall, black-coated figure a lighthouse of quiet mercy amidst the ruins. And when a group of formerly enslaved men knelt before him on the dusty ground, he gently urged them to rise, telling them that they must kneel only to God and thanking them for a freedom that was now a shared inheritance. The air was thick with the scent of charcoal and spring blossoms, a cinematic blending of the old world dying and the new one breathing its first, fragile breath. And as he sat in the chair of the man who had led the revolt, he felt no sting of triumph, only a profound and hollow ache for the unity that had been so nearly lost forever. The smoke of the fallen city drifted away to reveal a small, quiet parlor at Appomattox where the iron heart of the war finally stopped beating under the signature of a weary, gray-clad general. Abraham received the word of Lee's surrender with a silence that was more powerful than any shout, a slow and steady exhale that seemed to release the tension he had carried in his bones for 4 years. The bells began to ring in every steeple from Maine to the Mississippi, and the crowds gathered outside the White House with torches and songs of victory, demanding words of fire and retribution against those who had torn the house asunder. But when he stepped onto the balcony, the light of the torches reflecting in his deep, melancholic eyes, he did not speak of vengeance or of gallows. Instead, he asked the band to play Dixie, claiming it as a song that now belonged to the whole Union once again. He spoke to the nation with a voice that was soft and musical, pleading for a peace that was as wide as the prairie and as deep as the woods of his youth. He told the people that the task now was to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and his orphan. His words were a healing balm, a cinematic vision of a country where the soldiers of both sides would return to their plows and find that the soil was still their own. He knew that a peace won by the sword could only be kept by the heart, and he prepared to build a bridge of forgiveness across the chasm of blood, his mind already mapping out a path of reconstruction that was paved with malice toward none and charity for all. A hallowed, Expectant quiet settled over the halls of the capital as the first real spring of peace began to bloom, the white blossoms of the dogwoods appearing like tiny flags of truce across the hills of Maryland and Virginia. Abraham spent his final days in a state of soft, reflective grace, his laughter returning like a long-lost friend, his step lighter than it had been since the day he left Springfield. He sat with his cabinet and spoke not of punishments, but of the work of the hands, of how to bring the brothers back into the fold without the bitterness of defeat. He saw the South not as a conquered province, but as a wounded limb of the same body, needing the slow and patient medicine of kindness to heal the jagged edges of the soul. He took long carriage rides with Mary in the fading light of the afternoon, the sun setting in a sea of violet and orange over the Potomac, talking of the years they would spend traveling and the quiet life they might find once the burden of the crown was finally laid down. He felt the pulse of the country returning to a steady, healthy beat, the scars of the war beginning to fade into the stories of the old men. And as he looked at the unfinished dome of the Capitol, now finally capped and whole, he felt a sense of completion that transcended the political and the personal. He was the architect of a new house, a house built on the bedrock of liberty and held together by the mortar of mercy. And as the night air grew cool and sweet with the smell of new grass, he allowed himself to dream of a union that was not just a collection of states, but a brotherhood of man, resting now in the gentle, restorative hush of a victory that was won for everyone. The soft, healing light of a nation reborn seemed to linger on his tired face like the first warmth of a spring morning, as if the heavy shadows of the war were finally retreating into the mists of the past, and leaving behind a man who could at last breathe the sweet, untainted air of peace. Abraham sat in the quiet carriage beside Mary on that fateful Good Friday, the wheels clicking rhythmically over the cobblestones of Washington, his heart feeling a rare and luminous lightness as he spoke of the future, of visiting the Holy Lands, and perhaps returning to the quiet practice of law in the rolling prairies of Illinois. The theater was a place of soft velvet and flickering gaslight, a sanctuary of laughter and music where for a few brief hours the commander-in-chief could shed the weight of the Republic and simply be a man watching a play. He sat in the rocking chair in the draped balcony box, the flags of the Union framing him in a silent embrace, while outside the streets were still echoing with the celebrations of victory. Then, in a heartbeat that felt like the shattering of a glass world, a shadow moved in the dark. A sharp crack echoed through the hall like a distant, lonely shot from a frontier rifle, and the man who had led a nation through the fire slumped forward into a deep and final stillness. The laughter turned to a haunting silence, and as they carried his long, lanky frame across the street to a small house under the watchful stars, the world seemed to hold its breath, the rhythmic ticking of the clock in the small bedroom counting down the moments until the rail splitter from the Kentucky woods belonged to the ages. The gray light of a weeping dawn filtered through the windows of the Peterson house, catching the glint of tears on the faces of the iron men who had stood by him through the storms of blood and fire. When the last breath left his body, a profound and sacred quiet filled the room, a silence that traveled out into the damp streets and across the waking fields of the South and the North alike. The news spread like a slow, mournful bell tolling from sea to shining sea, turning the jubilation of victory into a sea of black crepe and hushed whispers. A funeral train began its long, winding journey back to the heart of the country, moving slowly through the silent towns and the lonely junctions, where thousands gathered by the tracks in the middle of the night, their torches casting a flickering orange glow against the soot-stained cars. They stood in the rain and the wind just to see the coffin of the man who had become their father, their liberator, and their friend. He was returning to the soil of Springfield, the same earth he had walked as a young lawyer with his dreams tucked in his hat. But he was returning now as a martyr, a giant whose sacrifice had sealed the promise of the Union in a way that words alone never could. The engine's whistle was a long, lonely cry that echoed through the American timber, marking the passage of a soul that had traveled from the dirt floor of a cabin to the highest altar of the human spirit. A celestial stillness settled over the prairie as the tall man was finally laid to rest among the oaks and the tall grass. But the shadow he cast grew longer and more luminous with every passing year. He became more than a memory. He became the very heartbeat of the American dream. A cinematic figure of granite and grace who proved that a humble beginning is no barrier to a destiny that touches the stars. The Great Emancipator lived on in the broken chains of the millions he freed, in the reinforced pillars of a house that refused to fall, and in the simple, honest words of the Gettysburg Address that continue to chime like a silver bell in the heart of every seeker of justice. He remains. In the quiet marble of his temple by the Potomac, seated in eternal reflection, his eyes looking out over a country that is still learning to walk in the light he provided. He taught us that mercy is the true strength of a leader, and that the common man carries within him the spark of a king. As the stars over the Illinois woods begin to twinkle in the velvet dark of the midnight hour, the spirit of the boy who read by the fire and the man who saved the Union remains a steadying presence. A quiet watcher in the shadows of our history, whispering that though the road is long and the night is deep, the dawn of freedom will always find its way home, resting now in the timeless, rhythmic peace of the land he loved so well, sleeping at last in the cradle of the ages.